advisor, UC Horde advisor. So thank you, Stephen, for joining us. And Paul is going to run us through the questions, and we're going to wrap up at 4.
We have 100 questions. We'll do it the best we can. And so what we've done is sort of separated the question into different groups. Fire, soil, biological diversity, and water. But actually, we know that a lot of questions may involve several different areas. And that's good. It shows us that things are together. The other thing I wanted to point out is something that I learned at a conference years ago. It was a criticism of college professors. And it was, because I'm when I listen, it was that a lot of times we focus too much on what we know, and we don't spend enough time trying to figure out what we don't know. So maybe that's something we have to bear in mind, that if there are really some areas that we need more research on, we have to be very open and accept that and admit that. Okay, so I'm going to start with the most incendiary question of the day. No pun intended. And this is, okay.
Why do you think it's for you, Greg?
To create plant lists, fire-prone plant or fire-resistant plants, are you relying on scientific research or on a shared experience of recent fires? What is the current status on using plant lists?
Oh, probably.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll pass it on. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, this might actually go backwards. I don't know how it works.
Could you repeat the question?
The question was about fire-resistant plant lists specifically, whether there's any science behind it or whether it's just anecdotal evidence, experience. I think it's largely anecdotal evidence and experience on the fire-resistant plant lists. The fire-safe marin is, we think, one of the first fire-resistant plant lists published in the early 90s in cooperation with UC Cooperative Extension. We have some qualms with it. We don't think it's necessarily the best approach now. We don't think our list is comprehensive enough. There are a lot of plants on it that are not natives. We've had to cull out invasive plants over the years because our understanding of some of those species has changed. We're leaning much more towards publishing guidelines and recommendations to the characteristics of plants than the specific species, especially for fire-resistant plants. And we hear a lot of times that there's no science at all. I think Greg's shown us that there is some science. There aren't any peer-reviewed studies that we're aware of that say this plant burns at X number of degrees and this one doesn't. That said, the fire-prone plant lists are a little different. It's a much shorter list. We publish that. They're virtually all non-natives except for a handful of conifer tree species that we have a vast amount of experience with that just aren't appropriate for landscaping around homes. Juniper, Italian cypress, pampas grass, and a handful of others are just dramatic examples. We don't need any science. I don't need a peer-reviewed study. I've seen it myself with my own eyes. You all have. We've got videos to show how those particular plants react to fire where other ones don't. Do you want to add anything, Greg?
Thank you. So in San Diego County, our suggested plant list, and I like that it's suggested, not required. I think that's a good approach because honestly, we don't. The longer I've been at this, the less I tend to agree with fire lists or feel that for all but a few species, I wouldn't be planting like chamise around under the eaves of my house, that's for sure. And I hate juniper. Oh my God, that stuff burns. And the thing, but as Todd was saying, a lot of it has to do with the characteristics of the plants themselves. Small leaf size, oil content, that kind of thing. But I've also had ground cover forms of chamise in gardens, in front yards that did extremely well in fires because they're low growing and because they were hydrated. And really, we want to really start to emphasize the importance of hydration and foliar hydration in these concepts. But most of the list, the exclusionary lists I'm seeing aren't too bad, to be honest with you. I don't have too much problem with them. Anybody else?
So just to add on, I think if you're asking a question, you're almost missing the point, which is you need to be focusing on how you care for the landscape and how you maintain it. You're not going to be able to pick a plant palette from a list that doesn't burn and that doesn't need care. And if that's what you're trying to do, we've wasted our whole day today. So to that end, they almost become more or less irrelevant, at least in terms of fire-safe plant lists.
Wonderful. Now let's move from fire to water. So there seems to be a little bit of controversy. I've heard several people murmuring. Traditionally, we've heard that drip irrigation is the way to go. And we have heard that some overhead watering can encourage diseases. So we seem to be now hearing that some overhead irrigation is great. Are we on at the beginning of a paradigm shift or a revolution in irrigation here? Any thoughts? Whoever wants.
I mean, I don't know exactly what the right answer is here. I think it depends on what you're doing, it depends on what you're irrigating, it depends on what you are working with. I don't think that there's like, I wouldn't say like absolutely this way or that way, but depends on your site and the conditions.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. It really does depend. However, when I'm talking to people about irrigating their plants, it's typically in a very like residential, highly populated areas. It's not out in like unincorporated areas. We have learned, or at least I was taught, that pop-up sprinklers, the kinds we used to use in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of evaporation rate. The water didn't even make it to the plants. However, when I have a little bit more time to go through a program, in addition to irrigation, I do encourage people to just hose off their plants about once a month, just to like get dust off of them, just to like hydrate areas. But I'm really curious about hearing what you're talking about with the whole practice of those micro pop-up sprays for natives. I mean, that blew my mind. So I'm really pumped to learn more about these other practices when we are looking at strictly native landscapes.
That's okay. No, just kidding. All right, guys. So, yeah, this has brought me knowing the controversy, and you remember that I'm a Bert Wilson disciple. So this started back in 1985, okay? So what is the general concept here? The general concept is that these ecosystems, we're trying to create ecosystems, we're trying to create symbiotic associations of plants. We're trying to encourage the development of mycorrhizal fungi and all kinds of biological organisms that we have yet to even identify. It is impossibly complex. We'll never understand all the variables, but guess what? They're all interdependent. So how do you do this? What you do in our philosophy that has really dropped our mortality rates down to under 10%. We try to emulate the natural ecology as much as we know how to, and not introduce anything foreign to the system. For us, drip irrigation is swamp ecology. It creates localized hypersaturation zones of anaerobic bacteria instead of overhead. Well, how does Mother Nature water her plants, guys? Okay, who here thinks you cannot overhead water a native plant? If anybody says that, ask them, how does Mother Nature do it? Okay, so that process of hitting leaves, infiltrating through the mulch, because the mulch isn't just a nice top dressing to keep the weeds down. Mulch is an integral part of the biosystem, okay? And the mulch begets the plant community, and the plant community gets the mulch, and it's a chicken and egg, and when you have to jump into that cycle to do a new landscape, that's why we use shredded redwood bark, because for us it's the closest thing to that natural duff layer that forms in heavily dense wooded plant communities. So part of that equation is we give them rainfall. What we use is we use a product typically called MP rotators. Are those popular up here?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so they're made by Hunter. I will let you know that, full disclosure, several members of the Hunter family are actually my clients, okay? But I didn't start using MP from Hunter. They were developed in Walla, Washington by a little company up there, and I tested some of the prototypes in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was manna from heaven. 0.49 inches of precipitation, 0.39 inches of precipitation an hour. It's perfect. And so we wash off the plants. And oh, by the way, I do like hand watering too. We call that beer watering. You grab the beer, you grab the hose. When you've done the beer, you've done water, okay? Works great. But aside from beer watering, I love overhead irrigation on a PV system, 12-inch pop-ups with what were called swing joints. So remember the old days is you trip on a sprinkler head, you bust it right there, you have to dig up 20 feet of pipe to fix it. No, now it's isolated and it's on a little adjustable universal joint. Works wonders. If you've got really small planters, we go to microsprays, and we use strip microsprays that only have 2 strings on each, one on each side, and we put them in between a pair of plants. That way you never have any blocking, and yet you still have that diffuse application. Or we'll use microsprays on stakes, or we'll even use these very flow adjustable heads that have multiple orifices, because that's sort of like, at least it's giving us a more diffuse application. We really try to avoid single point